Hello and welcome to Right Hearted with me, Stuart Wakefield. Today I am joined by novelist and short story author Anne Goodwin. Anne, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you, Stuart. It's lovely to be here.
Oh, it's lovely to have you. Now, I always ask writers kind of how they got going, and I was fascinated to see that you are a former clinical psychologist. So, how did those careers either merge, or when did you decide to make that switch from, clinical psychology to writing?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because I think they come from sort of similar needs in me in terms of how to understand people and how
Yeah,
to understand myself through that. So that my fiction's usually quite heavily character based, and I'm kind of intrigued about people and intrigued about the things that we keep hidden or that we find difficult about ourselves. So, as a writer, I mean, I've always written since childhood, and I had a sister who, well, still have rather, a sister who's 2 years younger than me. So I used to tell her stories and make little magazines for her and things like that. So I had quite a good audience from when I was young. However, aside from that, I was very shy about sharing my writing, and it was very much kind of like a private thing that felt like it's not right to do it somehow. So anyway, I went to university. I studied and kind of drifted into clinical psychology in a way, even though it's quite a competitive field and hard to get into. It was I was quite lucky to get into that. And that was quite intensive, as you can imagine, quite intellectually and
right.
emotionally challenging. So I didn't have much time for an energy for writing. And at that time, I wrote clinical notes and academic papers, conference papers, things like that. But I wasn't writing much fiction. Then I had my midlife crisis, and particularly, in a job which is about tending to other people's needs more than your own, I had to start thinking a little bit more about what my ambitions were or what I might want to do. So I carved out a little bit of me time to
Okay.
focus on my writing, to see if I could make something of it. And I mean, it was partly for the pleasure of exploring things that I was interested in, but I wanted to be published. I read a lot of fiction and
Okay.
knew, that was where I wanted to be with mine.
Yes.
Um, but it was a lot harder than I expected, really. When you write, when you're kind of used to writing, as a lot of us are, it's sort of writing in our day jobs, you kind of don't realise how different it is and
Yeah.
how much work has to go into it. So it was a long time really sort of learning how to do it, how to write something that other people would want to read, but worth it in the end.
Good. Yes, absolutely. So, what were your kind of biggest challenges? Did you think in starting to write fiction?
Um, I think it's just knowing that, thinking about how it's received as by the reader is
Right.
different to how you think of it yourself. And yeah, just kind of learning how to express things that maybe seem obvious
Yeah.
to to me, or don't, that aren't so clear and get how to get that across to readers. And I suppose the other thing is editing. I love editing now,
Okay.
but it was such a difficult thing of realising that, because the first novel that I wrote, which was completely unpublishable, I thought all I had to do was write 100,000 words and that would be it. That it would
Right.
be it would be done.
If only it were that easy.
Yeah, and of course it wasn't. So that kind of realising how much work has to go into it. But I mean, once I got that through into my head and adapting to that, it becomes something different and enjoyable in its own way. Because I love the thing of, you look at your text and maybe you think it's terrible or maybe you think it's brilliant, and it's quite hard to sort of position yourself in between that. But to look at something that you've written and discover how you can make it better and in all kinds of ways and more meaningful, I really enjoy doing that.
So how did you? I don't meet many writers who enjoy editing. What is it about editing that you do enjoy?
Yeah. I think it's just that there's a moment when it changes from being, oh, this is dull and boring, and do I have to think about, does that comma go there or there, and, what's the better word? And then it seems to just, for me, to go down to a deeper level where I'm more, I've thought that I was emotionally engaged with the material before that, but it goes deeper, and I find that I'm more into the characters, the situation, and I can see that I'm definitely making it better. So it's that, I think it's the realization that it's getting better that I like. And
Good. I used to hate editing until I started working with an editor, and I kind of learned to love it, which is kind of why I do what I do now. I did. There was something we have in common other than both being authors, and that is both of us were up for the Polari First Book Prize, and thankfully we weren't up at the same time, because I think you probably would have certainly would have beaten me. But I was one of 10 books longlisted, and you were one of 6 shortlisted. So you were shortlisted in 2016.
yes,
Tell me more about that book, Sugar and Snails.
this is Sugar
Beautiful
and
cover.
Snails.
Beautiful covers. They're gorgeous.
Isn't it? This is about a woman who's kept her past identity a secret for 30 years, afraid she'll lose everything if the secret gets out. She's felt a misfit as a child and has found a way to fix herself in her teens. Unfortunately, solving one problem has created another, and she's stuck with this secret, and it's impacted on. She's kind of reserved with other people, always anxious about what's going to happen. So it's kind of blighted her life, even though she's relatively, she's got a decent job, but she's always kind of looking over her shoulder.
Where did the inspiration for that character? Where did that come from?
It's always difficult to know sort of where these ideas come from, isn't it? And because of my work as a clinical psychologist, people have often assumed that it's come from there, but it's not really. I don't have, other than being interested in character I was interested in invisible vulnerabilities, which is I suppose, what a big factor in Diana, the main character's life. And one of the things, there was quite a few things came together to make the story sort of. It was often sort of not really kind of planned, but just the inspiration came from various areas. But there was, I remember reading a newspaper report about a woman who was actually a professor of psychology somewhere. So she was quite successful. She died of anorexia nervosa, and none of her colleagues or family knew that she had these difficulties. Now, she must have been very skinny to die of it, and yet she was so, I guess, so competent in other areas of her life that she covered it up. So although this novel isn't about a woman with anorexia nervosa, it is about a woman who has self-harmed since childhood, and she's successfully kept that hidden. So I was quite interested in that factor of how many of us do that to a degree. I think people are quite lucky if they don't have anything that they feel makes them feel vulnerable or they want to hide. And I was kind of interested in this notion of a false self that's built up to protect the vulnerable side. I was also just kind of generally interested in adolescence. It's about a woman who's the contemporary strand, which is set in 2004, is about her in middle age. So it's kind of a midlife coming of age story. But there are flashbacks to her childhood and adolescence, which was quite challenging for her. And generally, I was interested in adolescence. My own adolescence had been very difficult, and I don't think I've ever completely got over it. And sometimes I'm just amazed at, when you think of the physical and psychological changes we go through in adolescence, I'm amazed at how well generally we survive that and get through it. There's just so much going on at that time. So I was interested in exploring that. And I was interested in the concept of gender, what that means, why it means a lot to us. And in a way, there's a line in the book which is a bit tricky because it's got to do with nerdy aspect of mathematics. But the Diana's best friend Venus, who doesn't know her secret, but has always been supported, is a mathematician, and when they're talking about gender, the kind of looking at why does that matter? Something that's kind of, it's socially constructed, so in a way it's not real, but it has such an impact. And she says it's like God and the square root of -1. And the square root, it's a very nerdy thing, but the square root of -1 is a lovely thing in mathematics that enables amazing calculations to be done. But it's not real, because if I'm really, really rambling here, but if you know if you think about a number squared, it's always a positive number. So there
Right.
isn't a real square root of -1. Maybe we need to gloss over that before everybody turns off. But yeah, so those were the three things that I was interested in invisible vulnerabilities, adolescence, and gender.
So, if I'm very open, I had a breakdown about 20 years ago, and I was in the mental health unit for 1 week, and what I experienced there, I could easily write a book about, or at least three or four, very kind of compassionate, although troubled characters. With a career in clinical psychology, I would imagine you've got some pretty eye-watering stories to tell. How much do you think of your clinical experience either you bring or you would consider bringing to your writing?
Yeah. First of all, I can't, I do, I do, people have told me some interesting stories, those which influence me as a person who I am, and therefore, to some degree, influence my writing. However, I can't actually share those stories because they're told to me in confidence. But I think a big thing for me that I get from my career is the training in understanding character and the what lies underneath what we show on the surface, and empathy. I think all fiction writers tend to be, quite good at empathy, because we have to get inside the heads of another character who may be somebody who's quite different to us, or maybe similar to us, but making those differences. But that is so embedded in my training and my work. And I suppose the kind of comfort with mental health issues or mental disturbance of to any degree, to sort of like to a minor degree, that I feel quite pulled towards that, which can make for quite interesting characterization. You're smiling.
So do you think that background makes you kind of especially good at giving characters kind of psychological complexity?
Yeah, I think that's where it comes from for me. I think other writers get it in a different way. I'm not saying that necessarily it makes me a better writer, but in terms of how I think about people is quite fundamental, really, to me.
Good. So I was also interested in I think your second novel, Underneath, which is about a man who is going to become a father and then kind of psychologically unravels. So, I mean, it looks very disturbing, but I mean, for all the right reasons. Again, it has a beautiful cover. The book jacket copy is absolutely fantastic, and all of your books. I was doing research for this interview. I've added to my want to read pile, and to be fair, I could have done that based on your book covers alone.
Thank
When you
you.
put that in with your book jacket copy, I mean, for me, it's like I have to read this book. And you've got fantastic reviews across Sugar and Snails and Underneath. Can you give us a little bit of a flavour about kind of what Underneath is really about, what themes you're exploring?
Yeah, just saw that again. So yeah, like you say, I mean, it's a man who things start to go wrong for him when he in a way, I mean, I don't really like to use this word, but it's the easiest to come to me, when he becomes more normal. So it's like he's drifted. He's kind of an overgrown adolescent in a way. He's 40 and he's drifted. He's enjoyed sort of travelling abroad, working abroad in different bits of jobs, but he decides it's time to settle down. His mother is now in a care home with dementia, so he's going to move back to Britain, perhaps to be nearer her, or perhaps not really. So he's come into some money. He buys a house, and he meets a lovely woman, Lisa, who agrees to move in with him, and he gets a job, so it's steady, and he, but Lisa, and one of the things that draws them together is that neither of them want to have children, and he doesn't really explore his reasons, but he's never known his father. His parents were married, his father died before he was born, and his mother was grieving at the time that she was nursing him, which had an impact on how much she could bond with him and care for him in the way that he needed. He's very unpsychological in how he looks at things, so he doesn't kind of really think about that. Liesl decides, actually changes her mind. She does want to start a family. Time's ticking on for her, so she's eventually, after several conversations trying to persuade him, she issues an ultimatum that she will leave if he won't agree. And that's when, again, I'm going to show the cover. So he lives in a house which has a cellar at the house at the top, and he has a cellar. So he has an idea that he doesn't really want to choose between Liesl and fatherhood, or opting out of fatherhood. So he has an idea of how he can make her stay, and he does have a cellar in the house. It is quite disturbing, but it's more psychological suspense than a thriller. It doesn't have it does have twists to it. It isn't perhaps as plot based as people would expect from a thriller. And because it's narrated by Steve, the main character, the man, it's very much like from his point of view. How does he try to justify his behaviour and rationalise what's going on for himself as much as for anyone? And the question is, can that work out for him? Perhaps it won't.
And what were the challenges of getting kind of inside the head of that kind of narrator?
Again, I didn't find it that difficult, which is kind of worrying. And I mean, he's not a nice character, but because I've been inside him and I kind of know why he is the way he is, he's not. I mean, I wouldn't justify what he does by any means, but I do have some sympathy for his motivations, if not for his actions. So sometimes in if in reviews people are saying, "Oh, it's terrible, it's horrible," they're all horrible characters. I'm thinking, but it's my Steve, poor Steve. So yeah, I didn't find it. So I mean, what obviously, it's the layers and layers and layers that you go into, and
Yeah.
as the author. But I didn't find him particularly any more difficult than any other characters to get into.
Okay. Well, as I say, it's on my TBR list. Having looked at some of the reviews, I mean, I write romance. So I love reading light and fluffy, but because of my job, have to read very wide. And having seen the reviews when people are, unsettling, chilling, twists, all that kind of thing, I'm just like, okay, romance might be my thing, but I absolutely have to read this book.
I
Um,
love the sense. I mean, this is kind of an anti-romance, isn't it? In the sense of
yeah,
this is
yeah. And, I
this
think
two
it's
people have got
interesting
together,
to
and
explore all different sorts of love.
yeah.
So yeah, I'm I'm definitely up there on one of my books to be reading very soon.
Uh,
So let's talk about Matilda Windsor is Coming Home, which is your latest novel. What brought you to write that? Because that's about siblings who've been separated for 50 years.
yes, yeah. So, yeah, Matilda Windsor's Coming Home is about brother and sister separated for 50 years, and the idealistic young social worker who tries to reconnect them. And the main character, although those three characters are 3 points of view characters, the main character, Matty, has been a patient in a long-stay psychiatric hospital for 50 years since she was admitted it's set in the late 1980s, 1990s. She was admitted in 1939 at the age of 20 after having what was called at that time an illegitimate child.
Right.
So her story is pretty tragic, but she is quite an upbeat character. She so she's in this hospital, but she doesn't see it as a hospital. In her mind, it's a stately home. Her family owns this place that she's the a society hostess. So the other patients are her house guests, the
Okay.
staff are the servants, and the psychiatrists who come to interview her are journalists who are wanting the latest society gossip. So she's actually both tragic and fun.
So if you have been institutionalized for that long, what's her kind of view of where it is that she's staying?
What's her view? So she it's likely that she's been unnecessarily, well, I mean, everybody has been unnecessarily institutionalized. None of them should have been there for that length of time. So because she's lost the skills that she had. She was admitted at the age of 20.
Right.
She was running a house at that time, looking after her younger brother. So, I mean, she didn't have a job in the way that a lot of women didn't. It's 1930s, didn't have in those days. But she had ambitions for the future. And all that has been lost. And one of the main things, particularly early on, before the 1960s and 70s,
Right.
what was rewarded in hospitals was conformity. People weren't encouraged were actively discouraged from thinking for themselves, doing anything that expressed their individuality and preferences and choices. So, I mean, one of the things that the tropes in the novel, which a lot of people recognise from the old asylums, was that tea was served to the patients with milk and sugar already added to the pot. So regardless of their preference, or even if they drank tea, that was, they just got it as it came.
Right.
So really, it was a mammoth undertaking for helping those people to recognise that actually they did have some choice in these very minor matters of their lives. And I mean, the novel set, as I say, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when the regime had changed quite a lot, and there were efforts being made to teach people or help them recover some of the lost skills. But that was quite hard, and because also economies of scale. There would be 2 or 3 nurses on a shift looking after 30 people. Very difficult to enable people to have express their individuality. Much easier to treat people as a batch. Everybody's the same. And in the earlier days, people didn't have individual clothing. They were bathed when the timetable said they should, rather than when they felt they needed to. So much of kind of lost skills, lost years, and lost opportunities, really. So to cope with that, my character Matty has developed these fantasies of what her experience is, where the place that she's living, that it isn't a hospital, and that seems to me a very valid coping strategy. Although from I don't know what your experience of psychiatry has been and how comfortable you are with that model, but the idea that her reality was less valid than that of the doctors who give it a particular name, a diagnosis, a classification. But hers has enabled her to cope. But now, when things are changing, change can be good. It was change for positive reasons, but it's also sort of unsettling. And it's she's 70, and nowadays 70 is not very old. But even 30 years ago, I think it was quite old, and particularly for somebody who'd spent a long time in hospital, had a lot of drugs, etc. So in the novel, I really wanted to honour those people I'd known there who had kept these sparks of individuality despite everything that was against them, in terms of that they was perhaps still dealing with psychotic experiences, hearing voices or whatever, and the regime that was so stultifying. Yet once if you could make that connection, that sort of spark of personality would come through. And the people who had been invisible, really. They'd been put away and forgotten about to a large degree. So yeah, so Matty with her bright polka dots, she's sort of making a
Very well
splash.
coordinated there, Anne.
We are.
So, if those of you who are listening, the cover of Anne's latest book, Matilda Windsor, Coming Home, is a woman carrying a bag, wearing a red polka dot dress, and Anne is wearing a very similar dress, if not top. So yes, beautifully coordinated there, Anne. How do you feel about the way therapists and psychologists are kind of portrayed in the media?
I think they're portrayed in a lot of different ways that what I feel. I mean, it's easy for me to answer that sort of in a back to front way. What disappoints me is how if there's a psychological issue to be explored, it's often a psychiatrist who gets to front that, who very likely doesn't have the expertise. Psychologists, I don't know, how do you think they're portrayed in the media?
And I just think that you often hear policemen who are watching like procedural dramas and things like that, and they get quite I don't want to use the word uppity, but they get quite passionate about the way they're portrayed and the way different procedures and stuff work. If you were reading a novel in which there was a therapist or a psychologist, then it didn't really feel like well researched. What does that kind of do to you? Does that like kind of
Yeah.
trigger anything?
Right. Yeah. You've touched the spot. Now. Oh yes. I'm thinking sort of like less in the media, but in fiction. I've read at least 80 novels featuring a fictional therapist, and not all of them are main characters. And usually there's something very, kind of really very inaccurate about that.
Right.
I mean, the thing about therapists is there's a whole range of different ways that they can be, and it's the same with clinical psychologists. There are so many different models. Almost, you could argue that any way of representing them would be okay. However, there's something that I feel is often missed, really, and one is that just how the therapist would talk to somebody is often just kind of wrong. That they're often portrayed as quite pushy in terms of the questions that they ask, whereas. I mean, I'm quite biased as well about the particular model of therapy that interests me is based on the psychoanalytic foundations, which is much more sort of exploratory. So there are some models that are prescriptive, but I think you need to, if you're writing about that model, you need to know it very well. So yeah, sometimes they're quite pushy. Sometimes they don't get to they solve the issue far too easily. That as if you just have to find something once and that there's the cure. Whereas often for therapists, there's the going round and round the material repeatedly. But often the other thing that's missing is the recognition that the therapist. Well, often there might be a recognition that the therapist will probably have their own issues. However, that there's often not an acknowledgement that the therapist will actually be dealing with those. So the therapist having their own issues makes the fiction interesting, because it can be addressed as well. And, we all have our vulnerabilities, and perhaps it's the vulnerabilities that attract us to that work. But a competent therapist who is practicing professionally will also be having their own clinical supervision, so they're not, trying to solve the issues on their own, and they will should have had or be having their own therapy. Whereas often in fiction, the therapist will talk about their clients with friends or kind of people in their family or things like that. So and I think that kind of gives a false idea of confidentiality, which can be, sort of quite upsetting. If for some, it can be off-putting for somebody who's reading about it and considering therapy.
Have you ever been tempted to contact an offending author?
I write reviews, so no. I can't. I review them, so that's there to see, and I'm quite picky. And other people do point out to me, well, I'm just picky because I know I've got the background, and in a way, it doesn't matter. It's fiction. But I do like locally where I live in Nottinghamshire. I run a little workshop on creating a fictional therapist, because there's so much potential actually to use a therapist as a character. Because you can have those parallel narratives with, and also that they can be the person who gets into the depth of the issues. So I tackle it that way. I'm not going to go around with a gun and so. But I think as well is the thing as well is, and this again happens, that some therapists do blur boundaries and are inappropriate and sexually inappropriate with their clients. But the way I see that happening in fiction is that they get into it too easily, too quickly. Whereas, I think, or rather I hope, and perhaps it's about, being overly precious about my profession, that people would be more cautious, really.
What I found a couple of times, coaching writers, when you start to get into why are you the best person to write this book, that can sometimes start to take a turn when I get doubts and I start to think, well, I'm not a therapist. I can go so deep with you to try and get you to understand or really think through why you are writing this material. But if that material is very sensitive and personal to a writer, what are there any particular warning signs that you think a book coach could potentially look out for before they kind of say, listen, I think you might need some kind of professional help?
That's interesting. I've not been asked that before, but it is interesting, and I suppose it applies to other areas as well. When we, or even sort of chatting with friends, is that kind of a realization that it's getting deeper than might be appropriate. I mean, but I would also say that you're not responsible for that, in a sense that, and I guess there are different kinds of constraint, sort of boundaries around that role that you have as a coach. Um, but I don't know. I mean, I was going to say if it's making you feel uncomfortable, but maybe
Mm.
I don't know how much of a sign that would necessarily be, because it could be about your own issues
Yeah,
rather than theirs.
yeah,
And it is difficult because it's kind of, if somebody's telling you something quite juicy, it can be tempting to sort of nudge them along,
yeah,
because
yeah,
it's interesting. But maybe it's about coming back to the task.
hmm,
What is the task? And if you're clear about your task is to help the book
yeah.
rather than the person, although
Yes,
obviously
yes, exactly.
there's a huge overlap in that, then I think that's your kind of safety line.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
I mean,
yeah,
for me, if they're crying so much we can't get to the end of a conversation, or we're having to kind of drop calls because obviously they're too emotionally impacted by the material we're getting into, then that's the point that right now I would say perhaps you need to go and talk to somebody. But yeah, I think there's definitely something in there about kind of drawing boundaries and what you've said, that kind of sixth sense when you start to feel uncomfortable yourself. Talking about
yeah.
being
I mean,
uncomfortable, so you offer a service that I've never seen a writer offer before, which is book clubs can book time with you, and because of the layers of the psychological angles that you're taking, your books are perfect for book clubs because you're dealing with a lot of different issues. I've never seen an author offer kind of online Q&As with book clubs, but I understand you'll go and like meet a book club as well. What's that like, walking into a room of readers who've had that kind of shared experience of your work?
yeah, it's. I mean, a bit of it's scary because
Yeah,
there's bound to be things that they haven't liked about the book, and you don't quite know what that balance is going to be.
right.
Which I was just thinking, we're talking about therapy. It's a bit like therapy being scary, that you don't
Yeah,
quite know what's going to come up. And it's also exciting because what I love, and I don't know, if you've experienced this too, is when somebody sort of finds something in your work that you didn't quite know you'd put there, and it's something that they like about it,
yes,
preferably. I mean, that is priceless. That kind of feedback that they've taken this story that's come out of my head, and it's sort of done things in their head. That this
right.
something new has come from it, and I feel that is such an honour as a writer to discover that about your work. That because every person, I mean, every book, every time a book is read, it's different. It
Yeah,
is a different book
yeah,
depending on the reader, and that people take different things from it based on who they are and what their experience has been. So I love that. And then when you've got a a group of people in the room who will also have different ideas, and they'll be sort of bouncing their ideas off each other, it is extremely rewarding. So I think it's kind of quite nice for book groups to have an author visit them, but it's very nice for the authors as well, in my
right.
experience.
Now, I often hear writers talking about writer's block, and I'm kind of in two minds about whether it really exists. I think there's something in there between procrastination and knowing there's a problem and being reluctant to get in there and tackle it. Um, from a psychology point of view, what advice would you give to a writer who is suffering writer's block?
Yeah, I I also kind of I'm skeptical about it. I think it's a fancy name for just not being in the mood for it or having an obstacle. I think, I mean, people say about, oh, just get out. I think there are two views of it's like, oh, isn't this terrible that, this dreadful thing that only writers suffer from because we're such sensitive people and, have to be very careful around it. And then there's another extreme view that I see taken is that, just pull yourself together and get on with it.
Yeah.
Plumbers, there's no such thing as plumber's job block.
Yeah.
The job is just to write and do it. And I don't really hold with either of those views. I think that we write for a reason and we stop writing for a reason.
Right.
And sometimes that might be that we're tired, that we actually need a break from it. And that's very difficult if you're a writer who has deadlines to meet.
Yeah.
You can't do that. But if you write, particularly if you're writing character-based fiction that uses your emotions a lot, then you're going to get a bit sort of jaded from that at times, and you need to go and do something different and forget about it for a little while. Because I really value, I think not writing is a big part of writing, and that people need to do whatever it is they do. We all do different things. I mean, I always, go for a walk, and the length of the walk might depend on how much I need to sort of process and get away from. Sometimes sitting down at the page or the screen and just saying, well, I'm going to do it. Sometimes that works, but I kind of, it depends, how long it goes on for, and but I feel that we should be patient with ourselves, be gentle with ourselves, and I think the writer's block that goes on for a long time is perhaps depression, a fancy name for depression, which might actually be affecting the writer's block, might be a symptom of something bigger going on in the person's life.
Yeah, I think you're definitely speaking a lot of wisdom there, and I think I will kind of recalibrate what I think writer's block is and how to tackle it. And it's been a pleasure talking to you today. Thank you so much for coming on the show. As I say, all of your books are now on my want to read pile on Goodreads. The best of luck with Matilda Windsor is coming home. It looks like a fantastic read, and thank you again.
Thank you, Stuart. I've really enjoyed chatting. It's great.
Good. All right. Take care. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.